Here's a quick list of all the prominent Democrats on record saying that the 2016 election or the 2000 election or 2004 election were stolen. Basically all the ones that Republicans won. So it was Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Jimmy Carter, Jerry Nadler, John Lewis, Dianne Feinstein, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Al Gore, several other U.S. congressmen, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson. So lots of people, right? Here's a list of prominent Republicans who say the 2020 election was stolen. It's actually just Trump and therefore every Republican. So no one will answer the question, did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? They just dodge it by saying this is like Tom Cotton this week on Meet the Press. This is Mike Johnson on ABC. They won't answer the question, did Donald Trump lose the election? They might say Joe Biden is the president, but they will never claim that he legitimately won. And this is a real problem. And today on the show, I'm going to talk mostly about the Republican side of that because they're the ones currently doing so. I just don't want to absolve the Democrats of any blame here. So let's talk about a few things. Let's talk about the sort of history going back of this claiming that elections were stolen. Let's actually talk about what happened in 2020. Let's talk about what's changed in those states since 2020 election in 2024 to assure that there might be some sort of, election integrity in 2024. Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I am your host, Blake Fisher. I'm a political junkie, so that you don't necessarily have to be. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time listening or watching today. Really appreciate you being here. We are ramping up to the election. I think we're 29 days away. I don't know. I keep losing track. I should be able to keep track since I'm trying to do a short every day leading up to the election. And, I'm just trying to keep you informed on what you need to know about. Although not a lot changes actually in this election cycle because Donald Trump's out there at rallies, but he's kind of saying the same crazy stuff over and over again. Kamala Harris will kind of barely get in front of the press. She's doing it a little bit more now because I think their campaign's a little bit nervous that maybe hiding her under a rock isn't a great strategy for winning a presidential election. Shocker. I think that anyone could have seen that this was going to be the case. It doesn't really matter how the media covers for you. It doesn't matter how you can have as many spokespeople out there saying all your warm, fuzzy joy stuff. And, I think that people in America just generally want to know the candidate and trust the candidate more. And frankly, it looks like they don't. Polls are neck and neck. This is going to come down to tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states. There's no indication it's not going to be a close race. So that's where we're at. But what I want to specifically talk about today is the stolen election narrative. We've been hearing this for years now, and obviously the focus right now is on Republicans because Donald Trump has never stopped complaining about the election being stolen in 2020, despite offering zero evidence that it was stolen. This bothers me, obviously, because I think the Russia won in 2016, not by changing any votes, not by actually swaying the election, but by casting a seed of doubt in people's minds on whether the election was fair or not. And so in 2016, we had all of the Democrats claiming that the election was stolen, that Trump was an illegitimate president. I've linked to in the show notes. I was going to play part of it, but I got a lot of those names of who the Democrats that claimed the election was stolen from a thing the GOP has on their website of 12 minutes straight of Democrats denying election results. And they're not wrong. This has been something going back to the 2000 election when George W. Bush and we had Florida and the hanging chads, if you were around for that whole debacle. And you know what? Good on Florida for actually, if you noticed, we have not had any of these problems in Florida post-2000s because they edited their election system and they made it not have hanging chads and all these kind of physical weird things that we had. We've got much better and safer and more transparent electoral processes in 2020, 2024 than we did even in 2000, and obviously even better than we did 20 years before that. So to me, there's no evidence that things are getting worse. Are there some municipalities, are there some states that changed some stuff in 2020? We will talk about that. But there's just no evidence that these elections are being stolen. Trump lost court case after court case, 60 plus of them in 2020 from November to January. And he lost. And there's frankly no evidence that he didn't. And just like there's no evidence that the stolen election claims of Democrats are legitimate. there was understandable concern in 2016, I think that we all had of where were things changed in the election? Did Russia change any votes? Did they access any voter systems? Was there any collusion between him and Trump? I mean, I think that these were fair questions and things to investigate. I think we should always investigate stuff. But laying the claim and then investigating has it all backwards. Democrats can't claim that Trump is an illegitimate president without evidence. They don't have any evidence that Russia stole the election. They don't have any evidence that there was collusion. They don't have any evidence that Russia changed a single vote anywhere. And by the way, Russia bought something like a few $100,000 worth of Facebook ads. To put that in perspective, each campaign spent hundreds of millions of dollars apiece when it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. So, Russia's ad buy on Facebook hardly could be that can't be the reason the election swayed. And plus, we can prove that they tried to get into voter systems. They did successfully get into a few voting systems as far as the registrations, but they didn't get into any actually voting machines. And here's one important thing to keep in mind about every election in America. We have 50 states plus some territories, things like Puerto Rico, places like that. Within those states, we have thousands of counties. There are something like over 3,000 counties in the United States, and every county has its own, sometimes electoral process. So sometimes these things are state level. Sometimes, there are obviously county level things too. There is no one system you can hack into, even if it was hackable, to change votes. So at the best case scenario, if you were a foreign agent trying to change U.S. election results, or if you were a Democrat trying to change election results, or a Republican trying to change election results, let's just say you wanted to do that on a presidential level, okay? Because that's what we're talking about. These stolen election claims are generally at the presidential level, although Stacey Abrams is an example of a governor that did it on a statewide race in Georgia. But even that would be a state level kind of thing. You'd have to get into the county that could swing it and swing enough votes that then on an audit of that county, which, by the way, 48 states do some sort of audit post-election. They don't count every vote every time, but they do sort of, statistical analysis of, registered voters versus the last election and make sure there's not any anomalies that are going on. And every state is different, so I'm not going to get into the details there. But this is something that would come up. And you'd have to guess the right county. And I just want to show how ridiculous that is, because if that was easy to do in a close election, especially one that's as close as this one's going to be, because according to the polls, this looks closer than the previous election. It looks closer than the 2016 election as far as the polls go. Polls could be wrong. I'm not saying they can't be. Polls have been wrong in the past. But generally, polls have this margin of error kind of thing. And if the polls are basically statistically tied in places like Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania, I think, was only 80,000 votes. It might have been more than that. Don't quote me on the number of votes that Biden won by but it was not like hundreds of thousands. It was a very small amount. It was only like 11,000 votes in Georgia. So, when we've got a really tight race, we can't even predict right now. Obviously, it's a coin flip kind of thing. If you're picking who's going to win, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris in any given county or any given state, we can't even predict that right now. No one is saying with any sort of assurance of who's going to win these swing states, and they can't be right. So if the pollsters can't figure it out, if the campaigns can't figure it out, what makes you think that some nefarious group of people know exactly where they need to swing votes in a county? It's a little bit ridiculous. So, like I said, we had 2000, and to be fair, 2000 had the Supreme Court getting involved. It had hanging chads. It had all sorts of discrepancies on how people were counting stuff, how people were tossing out ballots. It was a real mess in 2000. So I'll at least give them that we had an example of the swing state, Florida at the time, had a pretty bad electoral system. And so at least there was that. I don't think that most people were assigning sort of ill intent there. I think it was just a badly managed system, and a bad system where it was like a hole punch through. It was an absolute disaster. And so at least there's that happened in 2000. But, these Democrats also claim George W. Bush didn't win in 2004. And the next time a Republican won, 2016, they started that all up again. There are interview after interview after interview with Hillary Clinton claiming that Donald Trump was an illegitimate president. I think it's dangerous on both sides, because what places like Russia get out of this is when when our elected leaders or our leaders of parties or the people that we watch on television or listen to or read articles about constantly tell us that our elections are rigged or stolen or there's something nefarious going on both sides, guess what? People start believing it. So the problem with Donald Trump saying over and over and over again that the election was stolen in 2020 and then, bullying every other Republican to say the same thing, essentially, now you've got 2/3 of Republicans that believe that the 2020 election was stolen without being able to offer any kind of evidence that it was. And no one can answer the simple question in the Republican Party, did Donald Trump lose in 2020? For fear, it's a weird feedback loop because they are scared of those constituents that are maybe going to punish them at the ballot box for that opinion that they have. Keep in mind that no one is offering any evidence that the election was stolen in 2020. So that's what I want to talk about mostly, because as much as I blame Democrats for doing the same thing in 2016, they're not doing it right now, a few weeks before an election. I'm sure if they lose, they will pick it right back up again. I'm sure if Donald Trump wins in November, Kamala Harris and that whole gang will absolutely claim that it was stolen. But I don't trust anyone to not do that anymore. But Donald Trump is the one right now that claims that the 2020 election was stolen. He's never dropped it. I honestly think it's his biggest liability, because I think most voters in America, despite 66% of Republicans believing him that it was stolen, most voters are like, I think you lost, bud. And even if they're wanting a change from Joe Biden, and a lot of people really believe that Kamala Harris is kind of the same. She's not polled as the change candidate. So it's not working for her, the way she's trying to separate from Joe Biden. It's just not working for her the way that she wants it to. People are willing to go back to Donald Trump. I think that him continually claiming that 2020 election was stolen is maybe something that's keeping some normal people from voting for him. And we are talking about such a small number of people at this point in states like Georgia and Pennsylvania, Arizona, the states. We're talking such a small percentage of people. It's something like 1 in 10 Republicans are considering voting for Kamala Harris. That's a pretty big number if 10% of your party is thinking about voting for the other candidate. But I think those people that supported people like Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis or Chris Christie in the primaries are those people, specifically people like me that have a show called The Homeless Conservative, who are going, Trump, give me a good reason to vote for you. But the fact that he can't get over the 2020 thing drives me crazy. And I think it obviously drives about 10% of Republicans crazy. So he might lose the election because he won't drop this. And it's also just this thing because if you dropped it, it wouldn't be the thing that gets brought up on every single show with every single Republican in every single debate. And it's a problem, okay? This J.D. Vance couldn't answer the question. He had a great debate performance against Tim Walz in the VP debate, but he can't answer the question, did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? He dodges it. He tries to say we're focused on the future. I don't want to talk about the past. That's every Republican's answer, but Donald Trump talks about the past all the time. It's all he talks about is the 2020 election or the 80s or back in the day. He's never looking forward. He's only talking about his past grievances. So that answer doesn't fly either. So where does this all start? I think it mostly starts, like I said, in 2000 with the hanging Chad stuff. It happens in 2004 again too. And which I think there's no reason you can claim the 2004 election was stolen. I think there's just Democrats don't like to admit they lose. No one likes to admit they lose. No one likes losing, but we used to have a point in this country where you just, shook hands and you said, hey, you know what? I'm going to work with you, or, we're now the president or the governor or whatever of all of the citizens of this area that I'm in charge of now. Okay. That doesn't happen. So happens in 2000, happened in 2004. By 2008, we kind of get a version of the stolen election with the birtherism stuff. It wasn't exactly, such kind of a butt whooping in 2008 and 2012 by Barack Obama that you couldn't claim the election was stolen, but you could claim he was illegitimate because maybe he's not an American citizen. And of course, Donald Trump was at the heart of that whole thing, but it's all nonsense. And obviously there's a little bit of racism involved there that's a little bit grosser. So if you can't claim that the votes were changed, you can claim that, well, he's illegitimate because he is not a United States citizen, and therefore he can't run for president. So that's the Republicans' swing 2008, 2012. Then we get to 2016, and Democrats claim the election was stolen. Was there Russian interference in some sort of way of the election? Of course they wanted to interfere, but I would argue that they didn't want to interfere. I mean, sure, they wanted to change votes. I'm sure if they could have managed to hack an election system, they would have done it. But the real goal, I believe, it's pretty obvious, is to just sow that doubt in our minds as citizens so that we don't believe that the votes matter anyway. So maybe we don't vote. And I just think that it gives a dictator like Putin the ability to go, well, look, your elections. I mean, you say our elections aren't fair. Your elections aren't fair. You claim your election. Both sides are claiming the election was stolen. And I think he gets dictators and communist controlled countries like China. They get to claim that we don't really have democracy either because they're sowing doubt in our democracy. And I just think that it's very dangerous. So that's the lead up. And then 2020, obviously, we ramp it up with Donald Trump claiming all sorts of crazy stuff. Fox News gets sued for claiming that Dominion voting machines were hacked or some sort, some sort of Venezuelan conspiracy. I mean, these conspiracies are all nuts. And I don't want to go into all of them because I don't like to give nutty conspiracy theories any credit, but I do want to at least debunk some of their stuff, because I think it's worth talking about. I've talked about this on the show before, but I just thought we'll do one episode with all of it. So the most common myths about 2020 were first that, we had this 2000 Mules documentary that has since been pulled because they got sued for defamation or libel, or I guess it was defamation by some of the people that they claimed were the mules in this thing. They had it on video dropping off ballots, and they were not doing anything illegal at all. They were transporting ballots for like people at a nursing home or something like that. They did not do multiple drops. They did one drop. So this is like normal stuff, but this documentary claimed that these people were, illegally casting votes, and they weren't. And so they got sued. They had to pull all that stuff from all their websites, and they had to publicly apologize for it. The problem is when you read the original story about that conspiracy, no network like Fox News or Newsmax is going to come back later and say, oh, by the way, this ended up not being true. They're just not going to do that. There's no benefit to that. Their audience doesn't want to hear that kind of thing. And so they don't do it. And so, yeah, that never happened. The 2000 Mules thing, that whole Mules thing, never happened. Donald Trump's, every one of his 60 suits, he lost. Actually, there was one that he did some sort of standing for, but basically lost all those suits. There was no claim of election fraud. And that's because you can say anything you want on television. You can say anything you want in front of a press conference or, on TV, in an interview, or on a podcast. But when it comes to saying something in front of a judge, if you lie about stuff, you can go to jail for that or lose your law license. And so people are much less likely to lie to judges. And so in all these cases, they basically had to admit they didn't have any evidence. True the Vote is an organization that has been claiming the election was stolen in 2020 in specific states like Georgia. When Georgia sued them to say, look, you got to bring us your evidence that the election was stolen, because if we really do have election integrity problems, we need to fix those problems. And so they sued them. They show up in court and they said, we don't have any evidence. We don't have a single witness. We have no evidence that a single vote was cast that was illegal. We have no evidence that there was any fraud in the counting of the votes. They had no evidence. Again, if you're a Republican only paying attention to very far-right sources, or even just sources like Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, any of these kind of places, Breitbart, pick them. Pick all those kind of right-wing things. They're never going to tell you that True the Vote admitted in court that they have no evidence the election was stolen. Because again, they want your eyeballs, they want your outrage, and they have no interest in telling you the truth. They just want to tell you what you want to hear. And that's what Republican voters want to hear. They want to hear that Trump didn't lose in 2020. Just, I guess, to stroke his ego. Don't really understand. And so every time I've had a conversation like this with someone, so whether this is just like at a bar, with a stranger, or with a friend or something, often once I present these things of, True the Vote did this, the mules, just all the evidence that there's no evidence, the goalposts get moved to, well, there was a lot of stuff going on, and this is what like Tom Cotton will do, the senator from Arkansas, on Meet the Press this week, is he kind of moves the goalpost to, well, you've got to at least admit that there was all sorts of changes that happened during COVID that were potentially illegal by state constitutions. There was all sorts of funny stuff going on with the way people could vote. And I agree that I think we've gone too far in making voting accessible, for example, early in September. I don't think there should be voting for a month and a half. I don't think that Like, let's do some early voting. I'm fine with like maybe the weekend before Tuesday. I don't think we need a month of early voting. That seems ridiculous. If you can't block out a time on like Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday to go voting, that's kind of the extent of early voting that I think there should be. I think we have kind of fetishized voting a little too much and make it seem like there's just these wide swaths of people that can't manage to go take a little bit time out of their, maybe, like I said, pick 4 days or mail in a ballot, pick any of these things. My biggest problem with moving the goalpost to say that, they changed the way that we could do stuff is, first of all, in 2020, I'm not seeing any evidence. And by all means, if you've got some, send it to me. Blake@thehomelessconservative.com. Email it to me. Most of these changes had to do with COVID. So we had some stuff where there were drive-through voting kind of things. They were trying to do voting during a worldwide pandemic. Understandably, there were some things that happened. A lot of those laws that they passed temporarily in 2020 have since been edited to be different. So most of the things did not permanently change in 2020. They were temporary changes. Now, some of those I was very much against at the time. I thought that they sowed too much doubt about how the election would be, the integrity of the election in 2020. So that's the things I didn't like about it. But we still have audits of all these things. We did audits. We did hand counts in a lot of these close states. There are paper ballots in 98%. 98% of the votes that are going to happen in 2024 are going to be on some sort of paper ballot. So there will be a paper trail, which I absolutely believe we should have as a paper trail. And so we can audit these things. We can count them again. The trick with 2020 going into 2024 is they're going to change the method that they're going to claim the conspiracy is. So I said, I don't like some of the rules that changed in 2020, but there's not any evidence that it benefited Democrats more than it would have Republicans. The stupidest thing that Trump did in 2020, in my opinion, and the stupidest thing that Republicans sort of have always gone in on is the fact that they think mail-in voting helps Democrats more than Republicans. But statistically, and by looking at the data, it doesn't benefit Democrats any more than Republicans. And in fact, there's some things that say Republicans might have an edge, because if you've not noticed, the Republican Party trends older than the Democratic Party. And do you know who benefits, especially during a worldwide pandemic, of being able to mail in a ballot instead of go be around a bunch of people at a voting place? Old people. Right? So if you're in the 65 plus crowd, you were the most vulnerable to COVID in 2020. And Donald Trump was simultaneously vilifying mail-in ballots. He was saying you can't trust them. So Donald Trump actively told people in 2020, don't trust mail-in ballots. You got to vote in person. Do you think there's a, non-zero chance that thousands of people in one of those states that were over the age of 65 kind of thought, you know what? I'm not going to roll the dice on going out to a polling place today. Or not to mention, you've got things like weather and all sorts of things that can affect stuff. The hurricane this year is going to affect absolutely going to affect the election in specifically North Carolina. The hard to access areas of North Carolina, I don't understand how they're going to have the infrastructure in a few weeks to be able to do voting. It's going to be complicated. So weather affects these things. My point is that there's no evidence that mail-in ballots or absentee voting or whatever you want to call it benefits Democrats more than it benefits Republicans. And yet Republicans have been bad about getting out the vote in all the ways that are legal. So Donald Trump in 2020, like I said, just told people to not vote by mail-in ballots. He also told people after the 2020 election for the runoff for the Senate in Georgia to just not vote. And it worked because several 100,000 fewer people voted in that runoff than voted in that election in November. So fewer people voted in that, despite there being just all the money in the world being pumped into it by Democrats and Republicans to try to win control of the Senate. So Donald Trump is his own worst enemy when it comes to this. So anyway, we moved the goalpost. So now it's not the election was stolen. Now it's like, well, it was unfair. Or they go to, well, the press and the social media companies conspired to cover up the Hunter Biden laptop story. And I agree. The press did a bad job on the Hunter Biden laptop story. But claiming that election was stolen because of a suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which first of all, wasn't suppressed at all. The suppression actually made it more of a story. So I would argue that the Hunter Biden laptop story got more traction in the days leading up to the election than it would have if Twitter wouldn't have suspended the New York Post for posting information that it claimed was misinformation, but it wasn't. And this is where it gets into the misinformation thing. There's a whole conversation we could have there about the government or social media trying to label stuff as misinformation and having a very bad track record, specifically in 2020, of doing so, labeling something misinformation that ends up being true later. So, but that's not stealing an election. Twitter deciding to say, we're going to suppress this post because we think it's misinformation. And to be fair, even some of the people on the right that I pay attention to were kind of leery, whatever the word is, they were not ready to jump onto that Hunter Biden laptop story because it seemed too good to be true. The details of it, that like he was out of his mind and basically left a laptop at a repair shop for so long that it became the repair shop's property, and then they tried to give it to someone. It sounds like a crazy story, to be fair. But if that was a stealing the election, then did Comey steal the election for Trump in 2016 by coming out in October, like a week before the election, and reopening the thing with Hillary Clinton and the Anthony Weiner stuff and all the email stuff? I don't know. Do you think I agree that it could have affected the election, but I don't think that anyone would claim that I haven't heard any Democrats. Well, I have. Most of the Democrat complaining of him being an illegitimate president, the complaints are about the Russian stuff. They're not generally about the Comey stuff. I do think Comey did not act properly in that situation. It's not his job to come out there and make that press announcement. But regardless, I'm just saying, let's be fair and call both of those things that happened in the week before the election that might have affected it. But that's not stealing an election. So that's all I hear is moving of the goalpost. All right. So far, I've seen no real evidence that the election was stolen in 2020. I think I can rebut everything that anyone's ever come to me with. So point is, the election was not stolen in 2020. Joe Biden legitimately won. I think Trump would benefit from just saying as much. His pride just won't let him do it. But here's the thing. What's going to happen going forward? Because forget 2016, forget 2020. Let's talk about 2024 that's happening in just a couple weeks. And can we have faith that the elections will be fair? Let's just talk about a few of those things. So according to the Brennan Center for Justice, 98% of all the votes in the country are going to be cast in paper in 2024. So that's very auditable, okay? We can go in, we can do hand recounts. Like I said, 48 states require some sort of post-election audit. Most of those are some sort of accounting tool where they can go in and see, like I said, percentages, make sure there's not huge discrepancies in how did this county vote in 2020? How does it vote in 2024? Are there gigantic discrepancies where we need to look into that and see why the numbers are so much higher or so much lower, or the percentages? That's the kind of audit that they're doing. So there's always these mandatory audits that happen. But obviously when the elections are close enough in places like Georgia or Pennsylvania, there's automatic recount a level. So there's a certain percentage points where there's automatic recounts that happen no matter what. And I think that's a good thing. Like I said, let's take our time. I'm less concerned with getting it right on November 5th and going to bed knowing who won. I'd rather take the time, make sure everything's counted, make sure we've crossed all of our T's and dotted all of our I's. And I'm also fine with let's be watching this. Let's not take for granted that everything's just going to be fine. Let's have Republicans, let's have Democrats, let's watch the poll workers, let's make sure that there's nothing sketchy going on, especially in states like Georgia and Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, the swing states. North Carolina is going to be one, like I said, because of the hurricane. I'm concerned about what they're going to do in just the matter of a couple weeks. So, now we're not really talking about voting machines, though. Now the conspiracy is Trump laying the groundwork for the election being stolen by illegal immigrants. So he's constantly going around the country right now and he's saying, Democrats want illegal aliens to vote. Haven't seen any evidence that Democrats are trying to get illegal aliens to vote, but that's the claim from Trump. And therefore it's the claim from most Republicans. They have to go along with what he says. And it's clear that they're just laying the groundwork to be able to instead of saying that the Dominion voting machines were hacked by Venezuela or whatever, blah, 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 these kind of crazy conspiracy theories that are very easily unproven. Disproven is actually the right word. Sorry about that. Instead, we're going to blame it on illegal immigrants because it's actually a little bit smart because Biden handed them the border crisis on a silver platter as sort of part one of the plan. So if you don't just look at this as gross incompetence, you go, okay, the Democrats allowed a flood of immigrants to come into the country. What would be the purpose of that? It's obviously to get them to vote so that they can swing the election in 2024 to Biden or now to Harris. That's what the claim is, right? But to me, you've got to show some evidence of that. To me, to be able to claim that, you've got to show that some illegal people voted. So in one way, it's kind of genius because we know that it's true. Every citizen in the United States at this point knows that there's been a flood of at least 10 million illegal immigrants. The numbers are actually higher than that because the Border Patrol doesn't really count people that they might see cross the border, but they don't apprehend at some point. That's insane to me that we don't count those kind of people. But so somewhere between 10 to 20 million people have entered the country during Joe Biden's term illegally. That's a huge number. Okay, that's a very big number. And so I get why Trump is trying to say these are the people who are going to swing the election. Those are going to be the things that would show up, though. If those people are, first of all, if they're illegally registering to vote, that's a crime. Most states have a check on that by you have to provide proof of citizenship. So you have to provide a driver's license, you have to provide a U.S. passport, a birth certificate, some sort of thing like that to prove you're a citizen to be able to register to vote. It is already a law that you have to be a United States citizen to register to vote for federal elections. That's not the case in states. States can actually, they can let illegal aliens vote in their state elections if they want to. Now, almost no one does that. There's a couple of small municipalities. I think New York City tried to pass it, but it got struck down by their Supreme Court. So there's all these, conspiracies about illegal people voting, but there's not a lot of evidence that it's ever happened. Okay. So, but like I said, it's not a bad move because, like I said, we know at least that there's a lot of illegal immigrants that have shown up here. So there's some truth to the lie, and that's a better lie than just trying to say that like the voting machines were hacked, right? But so here's the problem, though. It should be easy enough to do voter registrations audits in states pre or post-election to see if that's happening, okay? We can see if this person on the list is a legal citizen or not, and if they tried to vote or not, okay? So here's the thing. Georgia did an audit and found that it was something like there were 1,600 votes over the course, I think it was from 1996 to 2020, I think was the date range. That's how, it was like 1,600 people had attempted to vote in those 20-something years, or attempted to register to vote even. And that's a total of like 1,600 in Georgia. They did this full audit of going back decades, and they found that many people that were not non-citizens attempting to vote, okay? Again, in 2020, very, very close election in Georgia, 11,000 votes. They didn't find enough illegal aliens trying to, or not necessarily illegal aliens, but non-citizens. They did not find enough non-citizens over the course of decades to swing that election. And that's the Republican governor these are not Democrats that are controlling this study. Okay. The Heritage Foundation, another very, very right thing. I mean, the Heritage Foundation is absolutely all in Trump's thing. This is the famous Project 2024 stuff. Okay. They did an analysis of legal actions in elections and found only 24 examples of non-citizens voting in the 20 years from 2003 to 2023. So the Heritage Foundation, again, a very far right organization that was trying their darndest to find evidence that illegal people are voting, found 24 examples. 24, by the way, very, very close election it's going to be this year. I don't think we're going to have any swings of 24 votes winning any state, okay? Brennan Center for Justice analyzed 23.5 million voters across 42 jurisdictions in 2016 and found 30 instances of non-citizens voting. So am I saying that there's never an example of a non-citizen voting? No, I am not. So that's the other smart thing about Trump going with this conspiracy instead of the voting machine stuff. You would have to like hack an entire system or a whole state or a whole county, and there's a lot of people that have to be involved in there. When you're dealing with illegal aliens voting, it's a one-by-one basis, okay? Now, I still say it's a ridiculous conspiracy to say that Democrats are going to work with hundreds of thousands, I guess, of illegal aliens, and no one's ever going to say anything. There's not going to be any paper trail or email or text message or something that proves that that was going on. Again, if you're making the claim, you've got to bring the proof. Like, it's not my job to disprove your conspiracy theory. It's your job to come to me with evidence, okay? But it's at least smart because there's individuals, and it does happen. There's always voter fraud. There was always voter fraud. It happens in rural counties. It happens in big cities. Certainly happens in places like Chicago, New York. In fact, in the last election, some Democrats went to jail for ballot harvesting in the primary in a county in New York. And so it does happen. There is voter fraud. And I'm not saying there isn't. But when we're talking about specifically Trump's conspiracy that illegal aliens are basically going to swing this election in 2024, there's just not a history of that having happened. That doesn't mean it can't happen in the future, but the election laws have gotten tighter and tighter. We have more states now that require voter ID to vote. We have more states that require, like I said, proof of citizen to register to vote. We have more of these kind of things in place. I am actually for voter ID across the board. I think that to me, there's a bigger harm. There's a bigger harm in not having the confidence that our elections are fair and that we know that people aren't voting that aren't allowed to. I just think that if you gave everyone that peace of mind, I think things would be better. I think that it would be better if we knew that you couldn't vote with a picture ID. I just think that would be a better system because people would have the peace of mind. I don't believe for a second it would disenfranchise the number of people that Democrats claim. Democrats talk about poor people and minorities like they're idiots. And I don't understand why that's not insulting to poor people and minorities, because they claim that, like, oh, voter ID, that will suppress minorities. Like what? Like black people can't get a driver's license? That's ridiculous to claim that they don't have the agency to go to the DMV or a tag agency to get a license. You know, you're what are you claiming? They like can't do that because they're incapable? I think it's frankly racist. I think it's also classist. I think it's wrong to claim that poor people or minorities can't do these very simple processes that we've set in place for like registering to vote and voting. Mail-in voting, I can go fill out a thing online. They send it to me. In Oklahoma, there's a system where after I mail it in, I can check to see have they received it. I can check to see have they counted it. I can audit that myself because we have a system that says, here's how you do it. And it's literally a couple of clicks online. I can even go view a sample ballot right now. If I need an ID, by the way, that changed in Oklahoma. I know Oklahoma voter stuff better, obviously, because that's where I live. You know, you had to have a copy of your driver's license included in the mail-in ballot. You used to have to get it notarized. That's kind of a hassle. You don't have to do that anymore, but you have to include a photocopy of your driver's license, something that I can go do at my local library if I didn't have the equipment to do so here. So it's very simple, and to me, it's just a step that would say, look, across the board, we require you show us who you are, so we make sure you're who you say you are and you are, in fact, allowed to vote. I think that would give more people in this country peace of mind. And by the way, voter ID laws are very popular with black people and poor people and minorities and all demographics. It's like an 80% issue where people are for it. Let's just do it across the board. I'm all for that. I also, though, am not for it at a federal level. I think states have to figure that out. I think that's a state thing. And like I said, 36 states require it right now. I'd like to get those other 14 on board. But, you know, some of them are not going to get on board because they're very blue states, okay? So Trump's own election integrity task force, back to talking about illegal people voting. So he created a task force in 2016, because this is actually not the first time he said this. He was still, despite winning in 2016, Trump was still really could not understand how Hillary Clinton could have won the popular vote. And so he just was convinced that there were 3 million illegal votes somewhere. And so he created this sort of independent council or whatever not independent council, but it's sort of investigative group to look into illegal voting. And they tried to claim that there were thousands of illegal votes and stuff. And they actually had to walk that back. And they later had to settle a suit and apologize to the citizens who were named in this specific report that they claimed there were like thousands of people that illegally voted in Virginia, and they were wrong about it. These were actually citizens that they claimed were non-citizens and released their information to the press. So they disbanded this thing a year later. Trump disbanded it and claimed it was, you know, deep state stuff that forced him to do so. He still thinks there was probably evidence, but basically they'd come up with no evidence that there was illegal voting by non-citizens in the 2016 election. Again, it just tells you a little bit about Trump's ego, that he still had to investigate fraud to try to figure out how he could have won. Even though he won the presidency, he could not let go of the fact that he maybe lost the popular vote. And I don't even want to get into that the popular vote doesn't matter, because it doesn't at all. I don't know why we even talk about it. But again, if you're going to make a claim, you've got to show the evidence. You can't just claim that something's stolen or the world's flat or whatever insane thing that people believe now, and then expect the other side to prove me wrong. No, it's like, you got to come to me with the evidence. That's kind of what I believe. So I just think it's kind of ludicrous to think that millions of illegal people in this country are going to coordinate somehow, and not to mention they're going to risk getting caught and deported or thrown in jail. Like, that's not most people. Most people, can you really imagine that there are hundreds of thousands of people that were in some other country? Like, you know what we should do? We should risk it, pay the cartel to smuggle us into the United States so that we can vote for Democrats. Just show me how that's happening. It doesn't make any sense, but that's where we're at. Okay. That's what we're talking about. So let's actually talk now about those swing states, because what I want to do, if anything, on this show is just, let's talk about the election integrity and have these states increased or decreased. How have they changed since 2020? Because the same states are going to matter. Okay. So let's talk about those states. Arizona's been kind of a mess. If you don't remember back to 2020, we were kind of waiting for a while in Arizona. We were kind of waiting on a while for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania took a few days. We were waiting for Georgia. We did not know the night of, essentially. And we did know in 2016, but it wasn't until pretty late, 2 or 3 in the morning Central Time, when it started to look, I think it was like 2 in the morning Central Time when Hillary conceded. And so in Arizona, we've got in 2022, so this is a midterm election, a fifth or 20% of all the votes cast in Maricopa County, which is the largest county in Arizona, were dropped off at a secure ballot drop box. So the day of the election. So Arizona has 3 different ways that you can vote. Essentially, you can vote day of, like normal. You go fill out your ballot. You can drop off a ballot in a ballot drop box the day of the election. So it's kind of a way that you basically take the ballot, you drop it off. So you're putting it in the box. I'm guessing that's just more secure than mailing it. Because the truth is, the U.S. Postal Service loses a lot of letters, loses a lot of packages. Inevitably, they're losing votes too, right? It has to happen at some sort of level. You know that's going to happen. And there was actually a really good report. I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes. I can't remember who did it, but they did a report on how many ballots they estimate are actually lost in the mail by the U.S. Postal Service. So anyway, so Arizona has an option where you can just drop it off at the ballot box, sort of, but it's a lock box. And then they also have mail-in voting where you actually mail it in and they accept those via the mail. So there's kind of 3 different ways they can do it. They had a law that said that none of that processing could happen early. None of it. They've changed that since so that they can count the mail-in ballots early, but we still have a problem with the ballot box ones, the actual ones that are dropped in the lock box. Those ones are not allowed to be counted until after the polls close. So if you drop off a ballot in Arizona in one of those lock boxes, that will not get opened up until 7 p.m., I think, is when the polls close. And so at that point, they'll open that up. There's another thing where they passed a law that says that you have to total the number of ballots that are inside of those lock boxes before they're sent to the central counting location, which can delay a little bit of that stuff. They also passed a law that said they can't release any of those mail-in or drop-off ballot results until at least 1 hour after polls close. So no matter what in Arizona, you are definitely not going to have any sort of results from mail-in ballots or from the drop-off ballots until 1 hour after the polls close. That's fine with me. I don't see any problem with that, but just know that there will be delays. And the reason I think it's important to bring that up is because last time Trump claimed, well, look, I'm ahead when the polls close, and therefore I'm the winner. That's what they tried to do. And because they knew that mail-in ballots were going to be more democratically heavy, okay? Because they knew they were discouraging Republicans from using mail-in ballots. And so in places like Pennsylvania, they knew what was going to happen. And this happens in every election. There was no conspiracy. Everyone looks at this chart that happened in 2020 as if it's weird that, oh, Trump's winning and all of a sudden there's this giant influx of ballots for Biden. Well, yeah, that's because they have all these mail-in ballots that they can't release, and Arizona is going to be the exact same thing this time. When the polls close in Arizona, you're going to see vote totals start coming in for an hour. None of those are the mail-in ballots. None of those are the drop-off ballots. And keep in mind, 20% of the ballots in 2022 cast in Maricopa County were dropped in the lock boxes. So a fifth of the votes this time, maybe approximately, maybe even more, are not going to even show up, and they're going to show up all at once, potentially an hour later or 2 hours later. Actually, it will be the mail-in ballots that show up at once. It will be the those ballot box ones will take a little bit longer because, like I said, they have to count them at the polling place, then send them to the central place to count. Okay. So they also, so that's Arizona. So Arizona, still going to be a little bit of a mess. I'm going to guess we're not going to get stuff till later in Arizona. Georgia. So Georgia had a lot of things that changed in 2020. And then if you remember in 2021, the Georgia legislature said, okay, let's actually clean this up. Let's see what stuff do we need to keep from 2020? What do we need to change? And that's when Joe Biden called it Jim Crow 2.0, these election laws in Georgia, which by the way are more lax than the New York voting laws. Okay. So there is no Jim Crow 2.0. There's not voter suppression happening in Georgia. There was a lawsuit in Georgia that Democrats are trying to bring to claim that there was voter suppression going on by these new laws. They could not find a single person in the state as a claimant that would claim that they wanted to vote but couldn't for some reason. They couldn't get registered or they couldn't get to the polling place. They could not find a single person to claim that happened to them in Georgia. So there is not voter suppression happening in Georgia in any sort of way. Don't believe the Democrats when they say that kind of crap, okay? But Georgia will allow processing of the mail-in ballots 2 weeks before the election. This is different than the last time. So if you mail in a ballot, they can start counting those starting 2 weeks before the election. And the new state election board rule also requires that poll workers open those ballot boxes after the polls close and hand count the number of ballots, similar to Arizona. But then they have to reseal those ballots before the counts can be totaled. So that's going to delay Georgia because there's this whole hand counting situation of every mail-in ballot, I guess. Or sorry, the ballot box ones. So Georgia's probably going to be a little late too. But, for the most part, I think Georgia has tightened up stuff. They have a rule that it's kind of caused some controversy, and there's still some fighting going on in courts about it, where they're going to let the letter of the law says that local certifying officials can pursue a vague, reasonable inquiry into election results before they certify an election. To me, the words reasonable inquiry are not specific enough. I think there should probably be some sort of triggers that say, if, like said, for hand recounts, for example, if the election is X amount of close or within certain percentage points, we do a hand recount automatically. I think there should be some stuff in there because I think this does allow potentially a Trumpy Republican that's on an election board say, well, I'm not going to certify the election because I think I deserve to have a reasonable inquiry. And as we saw in 2020, I don't think most of the inquiries were reasonable. So that concerns me because I think it's just one more way to say, oh, here's an official. This isn't some conspiracy theorist. This is a voting official that's claiming something was suspect going on. And I think all they have to do is say that enough. Like I said, every election conspiracy from 2020 is just from Donald Trump saying it and then people trying to find the evidence to back up his claim. There's no evidence there. There is no there. They don't have to have any shred of anything that actually shows that something nefarious happened. They just get to say what they want to. And I think this is going to allow Georgia to do that potentially. So that worries me on Georgia. Michigan changed quite a bit since 2020, actually. So they can now count mail-in ballots 1 to 8 days early. So there's this weird threshold in the law where I think if it's more than 5,000 votes at a center, they can count it 8 days early. If there's fewer than that, they can only count it 1 day early. So there's some, I don't totally understand the adjustments there. But the problem in a lot of these states is that in 2020, they could not count any of the mail-in ballots until after the polls closed. So they just had these stacks of mail-in ballots and then polls close, and then they can start processing those. There's quite a bit of processing that goes into mail-in ballots because most mail-in ballots, and this is not across the board, I'm going to use Oklahoma as an example just because I think it's similar to a lot of them. If you have never done a mail-in ballot, what it is you've got your ballot that goes inside an envelope, and you generally have to sign the outside of that envelope, and then you put that envelope in another envelope. So what it does is you've got the first envelope that they can open that one, and then they take your inside envelope. Sometimes some states have signature requirement matching where they actually have to look at that, compare it to your signature that's on record, make sure it's actually your signature. Or some of them, like I said, Oklahoma makes you do a photocopy of your ID. That would be in that outside envelope as well to verify, okay, this ballot is legitimate. And then you basically set that aside. And like I said, I'm generalizing because this is not every single state, not every single county. Then they set that aside. Some states didn't allow you to do any of that processing until the polls closed. Most of them have changed that at this point because they realize what's the harm in us verifying signatures and we receive this ballot, all this stuff. And right. And some of them are even allowing them to be counted. They just can't release the results until after the polls close. So I think that these are good things because they will get us results quicker. And why should we make people wait? I think as long as the results don't come out, I think that that's my only concern here, is that I would not want there to be some sort of leak within any sort of county or state election boards that would say, oh, well, we've counted all the mail-in ballots and Joe Biden has an X amount, or I should say Joe Biden, this is going back to 2020, but Kamala Harris has X amount of lead, or Trump has X amount of lead, while the polls are still open, or even before the polls open on the day of. I think that would be very bad. And that's my one concern. I don't want that to happen. So now Michigan can count these up to 8 days early, depending on the size of the county. And they can also count early votes at the time they're submitted, as opposed to, so like, as they come in, they can count them. They don't just have to pile them and stack them up on election night, but they will not publish those until you're just going to get a big batch that first hour after Michigan polls close. You're going to get it's going to look like a ton of votes came in, because anything that was mail-in ballot is going to show up on that first count. So then we go to North Carolina. North Carolina has a lot of problems because of the hurricane. Honestly, it's awful, way beyond voting. Let's not pretend that voting is at top of mind for anyone in those hurricane-affected states. It's terrible what's going on up there. But there's some problems. They're going to slow down stuff in North Carolina beyond that hurricane. So there's a new state law where it requires counties to wait until the polls close at 7:30 p.m. to begin counting any early ballots. So North Carolina went the opposite of Michigan, Arizona, some of these other states, and they've said, nope, you cannot count any early ballots until 7:30 p.m. after the polls close. So it will probably be hard, especially because I'm curious how that's going to happen. I don't know if we'll see an increase in mail-in ballots in North Carolina. It's kind of hard to know, because if you're displaced from your home, you can't request a mail-in ballot at this point. You don't have a home potentially for it to be mailed to. I'm not even sure that, there's the reason North Carolina is such a mess because of the hurricane, in case you haven't been paying attention, is because so much of it is rural and there was so much water that just changed the landscape. It just washed out a bunch of roads. There's basically no way to get into a lot of these places that have been, like not abandoned, but like they were abandoned during the hurricane as it was coming in, and they're having trouble getting back to those places to even search for missing people. So I don't see how mail-in ballots going to work very well. Maybe if you already had it, I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen in North Carolina. I think that it's going to be a mess. I think it is potentially going to be like a Florida in 2000 kind of level mess, potentially. I have no idea how it's going to work out, but they can't count them. So do not count on results from North Carolina. And a few months ago, Trump was so far ahead against Biden in North Carolina, I don't think it would have mattered, but that race has tightened in the months since, and ever since Kamala Harris got into it. So North Carolina is more of a swing state than it was previously. So that's something to be concerned about in my example. But they do require ID in North Carolina. That is a new thing. But they don't have signature match in North Carolina still. So again, that's always interesting to me that Republicans bring up and Trump brings up, well, the signature matching, blah, 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 or they don't require blah, blah, blah in Pennsylvania and Georgia. And I'm like, well, neither does North Carolina, but you're not complaining about that because you won North Carolina. So to me, if we're going to talk about these systems, let's talk about them across the board. Like I said, I think everyone should require voter ID. I just think that would give a lot of people confidence in the system if we did that. I don't think it's racist. I don't think there's any sort of gigantic barrier to getting an ID. And so I think we should do it across the board. I think every state should do it. But I'm all for having little quirks and stuff. I'm fine with different counties doing different stuff. It's what makes our elections hard to hack by outside forces, because there's not one system. There's not one voting system. Although I think there is still a lot of work that we could do on the integrity of those systems as they get computerized and with software. There was, I think, a Politico report. I think it was Politico. I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes talking about, I'm going to forget all the details. There was a state, I think it was New Hampshire, that did an audit. They basically had hired a company to write the software for their voting machines and stuff. And they figured out in an audit of that software that the company that they had hired to do it had hired some outside of the country programmers to do the software programming. And in the audit of it, they found things like the Ukrainian national anthem written in the code. There was some kind of weird stuff. There was nothing illegal in any of it, but the fact that they had used outside people, they had to do this full audit. They had to make sure there wasn't any nefarious code, any sort of backdoors or anything like that. It's a real problem though, because the states don't have a lot of funding for it. So what I would like to see happen, I would like to see the federal government be like, hey, states, here's a bunch of money that you can use to shore up your election integrity. And we've done some of this in the past, but I'd like it to not have as many strings attached to it, to say, look, these are the things we want you to make sure: that your software is well funded, that you're hiring American companies to do the coding, and that no one outside is doing it. We'd like to make sure that there are audits of that software. We want to make sure there are paper ballots. We encourage voter ID. You can encourage these things, but basically like, here's some money, because most of these states are strapped. So they're like going to the lowest bidder. Like, you've got to bid for these things. So then some software company has to do it, and they're trying to do it for the lowest price. And so they're having to outsource people from outside the country. We get these bad results sometimes when we try to be cheap about election integrity. And so I think we should spend money on that kind of thing. But the states are not like the federal government. Most states cannot run into deficits. Most states have to have balanced budgets. They cannot run into debt like the federal government can. So they can't just spend money they don't have. They have to take that money from somewhere else. I think it's well worth spending money on doing that kind of stuff. So, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Let's go to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is going to require mail-in ballots be received by the night of the election. So in 2020, there was this big fight about, are they going to allow mail-in ballots that were not postdated, but postmarked by a date before the election day to be counted in the days after. It's part of the reason Pennsylvania took 3 days to happen to count in 2020. So they haven't really passed any laws about allowing for the counting of ballots before the polls close, but they have said that, okay, mail-in ballots have to be received the night of the election to be counted. I think that's a good thing. Again, if you're doing a mail-in ballot, and by the way, I don't know if you've ever mailed something locally, it's pretty fast. If you're like in a state and you mail it within the state, it generally gets there the next day. So I don't see really why there's any reason you shouldn't have mailed that ballot in a couple days before at the sort of max or closest kind of window of time. I think that seems very reasonable. I don't think we can wait for forever on these ballots to show up. And I also don't love the idea, because I think it gives, some credibility to the fact that, let's say you're losing a count. What if you could flood the system with a bunch of postmarked ballots that were, I don't know. I'm not saying that's going to happen or there's any evidence that did happen. I just think that we should do everything we can to give the American people the resolve to know that, okay, our elections are fair and they're not being stolen by either side. So those are a few of the swing states that I think are going to be important. And I think the things that have changed since 2020 are important. I still don't find it very likely that we're going to go to bed on November 5th and know who won the presidential election. I just think it's going to be so close in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia. It's going to be so close in at least a couple of those states that there's no way we're going to bed and we're going to know on November 5th. That's okay, though. There's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing that says we expect to have those results the night of. That's why we have an election in November and we have inauguration on January 20th. Okay? There's a reason we do it that way, and it's because this used to not be so fast. We used to not have technology. This used to take a lot longer in the old days, in the 1700s when we wrote this stuff, okay? So getting it the week of is pretty good, I'd say. I'd still like to get it fast, but I want to get it accurate. That's more important to me than fast, and so I'm okay with not knowing the night of. So again, I think election integrity is paramount, and by all accounts, it has improved vastly over the last definitely 20 years. I mean, since the 2000 election, for sure. We've got way better elections. I actually love Oklahoma's system. We have paper ballots. They're very simple to do. You watch the thing go into the machine and it does a little count. And then we even have ways to like do provisional ballots. If you mailed something in, for example, you notice on the website they've not received it yet, you can actually do a provisional ballot in person, and then they take those two and they make sure they only count one of them. So I think we've actually got a really great system in Oklahoma that everyone should copy, in case you're curious and out there and you have the ability to. 48 states, like I mentioned, require some sort of post-election audit. So again, we would find out in these automated post-election audits if there were any, for example, millions more votes from a bunch of people that didn't vote the previous election because they're illegal here in the country. There are 36 states that require voter ID. Again, I think that should be all of them. It would be pretty great. I just don't think it can be federally mandated. I'm not for that. But things are better now than they were in 2020, than they were in 2016, than they were in 2012. We are consistently improving this. Does that mean there will be no illegal votes? No, I think that there will absolutely be fraudulent votes. Does that mean I think that there won't be any kind of goofy stuff going on at polling places? No, that's not what I mean. Does that mean I don't think someone will do something illegal and be arrested for it in 2024's election? No, I think it's very likely that that will happen. Someone will go to jail for voter fraud or at least be charged with it, okay? There's no evidence that that happened at the level that it would have needed to in 2020 to swing the election. There's no evidence that that happened in 2016 that it could have swung the election, or 2012 or 28 or 2004, 2000. None of these elections could have been swung by illegal votes, by fraud, by whatever you want to call it, even though Democrats and Republicans claim otherwise. Do we have an illegal immigration problem? Absolutely we do. And that's why Trump is going to jump on this as the way to say that this election is going to be stolen. So I promise you, if Trump loses on November 5th or in the days after, it's going to turn into illegal aliens voted, Democrats conspired with them, and they stole the election. And we're going to have to go through this for another 4 years, So Trump needs a scapegoat in case he loses in November, and it's going to be illegal immigration this time. That's just how it's going to go. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Homeless Conservative. I really appreciate you spending some time and being here. If you can do one more thing for me, I would love if you went to thehomelessconservative.com and signed up for my email list. It just helps me reach out to you when I've got new episodes out or potentially like new videos on YouTube, things like that. And plus, word of mouth is what I need, because I'm not trying to do the outrage thing that everyone else is doing. I'm not trying to fearmonger people. And the algorithms reward those kind of things, and they don't reward people just being reasonable. They just don't. And so this is not me like whining and complaining about it. It's just me saying, you telling someone about this show helps me more than any other kind of thing that I can do. So if you think you know someone that might enjoy this or enjoy any of the content, maybe send it to them. I'm doing a short every day leading up to the election, at least when I'm not lazy about it or when my air conditioning doesn't go out and it's 93 degrees in my office like it was this weekend. So check those out too. I'm trying to only give you the relevant stuff that you might need to know going into the election. That's it for this episode. I will catch you next time.